It was a cold March morning in the sleepy town of Willow Creek, the kind of town where time seemed to move slower, where life remained simple, and everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. Martha Collins, a 62-year-old widow, woke up to the sound of rain tapping against her window. The early spring weather seemed to match her mood, gray, somber, and endlessly dreary. It had been 4 months since her husband, Robert, passed away, and every day since had felt heavier than the last. Grief was a peculiar thing, it didn't simply vanish. Instead, it lived in the cracks of her daily routine, in the empty chair at the breakfast table, and the hollow silence of her house. Martha moved through her morning in a haze, the way one does when they've been carrying sorrow for too long. Her old coffee pot sputtered as it brewed a single cup, and she forced herself to eat toast, though she barely tasted it. The small library where she worked part-time didn't open until 10, but today she didn't feel like waiting at home. She grabbed her oversized cardigan, her purse, and an umbrella she'd inherited from Robert, a sturdy old thing with a carved wooden handle. The streets of Willow Creek were deserted as Martha made her way down Main Street. The town itself had been a bustling hub decades ago, but like many small towns, it had faded over time. Storefronts sat empty, their windows covered in dust and peeling paint. The diner on the corner, Lynn's Place, was one of the few establishments still thriving. It had been there for as long as Martha could remember. She and Robert used to come here every Sunday morning, sitting at their favorite booth by the window. Back then, life was full of plans, laughter, and dreams that felt too big for their small town. Today, Martha wasn't expecting much when she pushed open the diner door. The familiar jingling of the bell greeted her, and so did the warm scent of bacon, coffee, and freshly baked biscuits. A few regulars were scattered around the room, an elderly man reading the newspaper, 2 high school kids bent over their phones, and a mother with her toddler squirming in the booth. Martha sighed softly and made her way to the back corner, a spot far away from the window. She preferred not to be seen these days. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," said a cheerful voice. Martha looked up to see Grace, the young waitress with a perpetual smile and bright brown eyes. Grace had been working at the diner for a couple of years, and while they'd exchanged polite pleasantries, Martha didn't know much about her other than the fact that she was always kind. "Morning," Martha replied softly, offering the faintest of smiles. "Can I get you the usual?" Grace asked, holding her notepad but already knowing the answer. Martha nodded. "Just coffee and toast, thank you." Grace hesitated for a moment, studying Martha carefully. "It's on the house today," she said with a grin, as though it were no big deal. Martha frowned, shaking her head. "No, I couldn't. It's just coffee and toast, Mrs. Collins." "I insist," Grace interrupted gently. "Don't worry about it." Martha didn't argue any further. She simply lowered her gaze, suddenly feeling a lump rise in her throat. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that someone had noticed her, had seen her, and chosen to extend kindness for no reason at all. In a world where she often felt invisible, this small gesture felt enormous. A few minutes later, Grace returned with Martha's meal. As she placed the plate and steaming coffee cup down, she also left something else, a small slip of paper folded in half. "Enjoy, Mrs. Collins," she said softly before disappearing toward the kitchen. Martha stared at the folded note, her curiosity piqued. Slowly, she picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Her vision blurred as she read the words written in simple, delicate handwriting, "You are not alone. Small acts of kindness matter. Keep going." Martha hadn't cried in weeks, but in that moment, sitting alone in the back corner of the diner with toast she wouldn't eat and coffee she couldn't finish, tears welled in her eyes. She turned toward the front of the diner, looking for Grace, but the young woman was busy helping another table. Martha clutched the note tightly in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in months, a flicker of warmth, a tiny ember of hope in her chest. She finished her coffee and left a generous tip on the table, though Grace had said it was on the house. As she walked back out into the rain, she felt the world around her shift slightly. The town didn't look so gray anymore. The soft drizzle on her umbrella seemed less like a burden and more like music she hadn't heard in years. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, Martha's quiet life took another unexpected turn. She was shelving books at the library when she heard the door creak open. She turned to see a man in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed back, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He looked so out of place in their small-town library that Martha paused mid-shelf. "Mrs. Collins?" the man asked, his voice calm and professional. Martha adjusted her glasses. "Yes, that's me." The man offered a polite smile. "My name is Benjamin Thompson. I'm an attorney with Grayson and Associates. May I have a moment of your time?" Martha blinked, her heart beginning to race. "Of course. I suppose," she stammered, leading him to one of the wooden reading tables. She sat down across from him, clutching her hands together nervously. Mr. Thompson opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it carefully in front of her. "I'm here regarding an inheritance," he said. Martha froze. "An inheritance? There must be some mistake." "I assure you, Mrs. Collins, there's no mistake," Mr. Thompson said calmly. "A gentleman named William Fletcher recently passed away. You were named as a beneficiary in his will." Martha felt as though the room had tilted. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said, shaking her head. Mr. Thompson adjusted his tie and handed her a letter sealed with wax. "I understand this may be a surprise. Mr. Fletcher's instructions were very specific. He wanted you to have this." Martha's hands shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words stopped her cold. "Dear Mrs. Collins, you won't remember me, but years ago, you saved my life. This is my way of saying thank you." The rest of the letter blurred together as Martha tried to comprehend what she was reading. She looked up at Mr. Thompson, who was watching her patiently. "Who was he?" she whispered. "That's something we'll need to discuss in detail," he said. "But first, I'll need you to come to my office. There are some formalities to go over." Martha nodded numbly, her mind spinning. She didn't know William Fletcher. Or did she? The name sparked no recognition, and yet, there was a strange familiarity in the words he'd written. As Mr. Thompson packed up his briefcase, he paused. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the smallest gestures leave the greatest impact. Mr. Fletcher often said that." Martha sat in silence long after he left, the letter still in her trembling hands. Her thoughts went back to the diner, to Grace's note, and to the stranger who had suddenly reappeared in her life, this time not with a meal, but with something far more extraordinary. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The following morning, Martha awoke with an uneasy weight in her chest. Sleep had been elusive, her mind replaying the events from the day before like a film reel on loop. The manila envelope from Mr. Thompson now sat on her kitchen table, unopened aside from the cryptic letter. She'd read those words over and over until they were etched into her mind. "You won't remember me, but years ago, you saved my life. This is my way of saying thank you." Who was William Fletcher? What life had she saved? The thought seemed absurd. Martha was no hero. She was just an ordinary woman who'd spent the better part of her life folding laundry, paying bills, and sharing quiet dinners with her late husband. She spent the morning avoiding the envelope. She washed the dishes, swept the kitchen floor, and even pulled weeds in the small garden Robert had once tended so carefully. But no matter how much she busied herself, the questions returned like an itch she couldn't scratch. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, she realized she couldn't avoid it any longer. Martha grabbed her coat and purse and decided to make the trek to Mr. Thompson's office. The law office was located in the neighboring town, about 15 miles from Willow Creek. It was one of those sleek, modern buildings with walls of glass and polished floors that made Martha feel instantly out of place. When she entered the lobby, her sensible shoes squeaked against the marble tiles, and she flushed, pulling her coat tighter around herself. A young receptionist greeted her with a rehearsed smile and gestured for her to sit. "Mr. Thompson will be right with you," she said, her voice smooth and professional. Martha nodded and sank into one of the leather chairs, her hands gripping her purse in her lap. The minutes dragged on, and just as she began to consider leaving, Mr. Thompson appeared at the doorway. "Mrs. Collins," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Martha followed him through a long corridor into a quiet office lined with shelves of legal books. Sunlight poured through a large window behind Mr. Thompson's desk, illuminating the room in a soft glow. He gestured to a chair across from his desk as he sat down, opening the manila folder again. "I'm sure you have questions," he began. Martha gave a shaky laugh. "That's an understatement." Mr. Thompson smiled politely. William Fletcher was a private man, but his final wishes were clear. You were to be notified personally, and his estate has been left, in part, to you. Martha's brows furrowed. "But I don't know him. I've never even heard the name." Mr. Thompson steepled his fingers, considering her for a moment. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Fletcher's." Instructions included a detailed note about an incident that took place over 30 years ago. "Do you recall, perhaps, a time when you helped someone, a stranger, in need?" Martha opened her mouth to argue, to say she hadn't done anything extraordinary in her life. But then she stopped. Something did tug at the back of her memory, faint and blurry, like an old photograph left out in the sun. It wasn't clear enough to hold on to, but it was there, a shadow of something long forgotten. I don't know," she admitted finally. "I suppose it's possible. But 30 years? That's half a lifetime ago." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Sometimes the smallest acts have the greatest consequences. William Fletcher made it clear that whatever you did for him all those years ago changed the course of his life. He went on to build a successful career, and as he had no close family, he wanted to leave his legacy to the person who gave him hope when he needed it most." Martha's heart pounded as she listened. The words felt surreal, like she'd stumbled into someone else's story. "How much?" she asked quietly, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. Mr. Thompson's expression softened. $500,000. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at him, unable to process the number. $500,000? It might as well have been $1 billion. She'd spent her life scrimping and saving, stretching every dollar until it screamed. She'd grown up in a working-class family, where dreams of wealth were nothing more than fairy tales. Even now, in her 60s, she barely got by on her meager wages and Robert's small pension. $500,000 was unfathomable. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "There is no mistake," Mr. Thompson assured her. "The funds are secured, and all we need is your signature to finalize the transfer. There's just one condition." Martha froze. "Condition?" "Yes. Mr. Fletcher stipulated that the money must be used to help others. He didn't want you to keep it all for yourself. He believed that kindness should inspire more kindness." Martha sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. The room felt too small, the air too thick. "Help others," she repeated softly. "Precisely. He didn't specify how, but he trusted you would know what to do." The ride home was a blur. Martha drove on autopilot, barely noticing the landscape as it passed outside her window. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief, confusion, and unease. When she finally pulled into her driveway and shut off the car, she just sat there, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Who was she to decide how to spend such a fortune? And why had William Fletcher entrusted her, of all people, with this responsibility? That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The condition of the inheritance weighed heavily on her shoulders. She thought of the people in Willow Creek, the struggling families, the empty storefronts, the neighbors scraping by just like she had. What would Robert have done in her shoes? He had always believed in the goodness of people, always said that the world could change if everyone did their small part. By morning, Martha had made a decision. She would honor William Fletcher's wishes. She would use the money to help others, but first, she needed a plan. She returned to Lynn's place that afternoon, as if drawn there by some invisible force. Grace was there again, moving between tables with her usual warmth and energy. Martha watched her for a moment before calling her over. "Mrs. Collins," Grace said with a smile, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Back so soon?" Martha folded her hands on the table, studying the young woman before her. "You left me that note the other day, didn't you?" Grace's smile faltered for a moment before returning, softer this time. "I did." "Why?" Martha asked. Grace shrugged lightly, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I don't know. You looked like you needed it." Martha nodded, her throat tightening. "Sometimes kindness comes full circle," she said softly. Grace tilted her head, clearly puzzled, but Martha didn't explain. Not yet. Instead, she ordered a full breakfast, something she hadn't done in months, and spent the rest of the afternoon thinking. By the time she left the diner, her plan had begun to take shape. She would start small. She'd use the money to help people like Grace, people who quietly carried the weight of the world on their shoulders while still managing to shine light into the lives of others. Martha didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew this much: William Fletcher's final act of generosity had set something in motion. It was up to her now to see it through. What she didn't realize, as she walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, was that this decision, this single choice, would soon ripple through the town of Willow Creek in ways no one could have predicted. The next few days were a blur for Martha, her mind occupied by thoughts of the unexpected fortune and the responsibility that came with it. She spent her mornings at the library, as usual, though her heart wasn't in it. She found herself distracted, staring out the window or gazing blankly at the shelves of books she'd always loved. By evening, she'd sit at her small kitchen table with a notepad, scribbling ideas and then crossing them out. Her hand would hover over the pen as she thought about all the ways this money could change lives, but none of her ideas felt like enough. What would William Fletcher want? She didn't know him, didn't remember him, not truly. It felt strange to be entrusted with something so profound by a man she'd long forgotten, as though the universe had mistaken her for someone wiser, someone capable of knowing the exact right thing to do. Help others, he'd written. Such a simple request, yet it carried the weight of the world. By the fourth day, Martha was at her wits' end. She decided to clear her mind the only way she knew how, by walking. Robert had always loved walking in the evenings, and it had been one of their traditions for years. She pulled on her coat and set off toward Main Street, where the soft glow of shop windows cast warm light against the deepening dusk. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of wood smoke, and the quiet rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement was soothing in a way she hadn't expected. As she passed the hardware store, she spotted a man, Frank Mitchell, loading a box of tools into his truck. Frank was one of the town's carpenters, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a permanent grease stain on his cap. He'd done odd jobs around town for as long as Martha could remember, though his business had fallen on hard times lately. She thought of the empty buildings downtown, of the way Willow Creek seemed to be folding in on itself, and a new thought struck her like a lightning bolt. "Frank," she called impulsively. Frank turned, squinting toward her through the evening light. "Mrs. Collins," he said, clearly. Surprised to see her. "Everything all right?" Martha hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. I need your help," she said, her voice firm despite the pounding of her heart. "Meet me at the diner tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything then." Frank looked puzzled but nodded all the same. "Sure thing, ma'am." That night, Martha barely slept. An idea had begun to form, tentative, imperfect, but alive. She spent the early hours writing out her thoughts, making a list of what she'd need, who she'd need. The words, "start small," kept echoing in her mind. When the sun finally rose, she felt both exhausted and exhilarated, as though a seed had been planted in her heart and was already taking root. At 8 a.m. sharp, Martha arrived at Lynn's place. Grace greeted her with the same warm smile, though her eyes were lined with tiredness. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," she said as she wiped down a table. "Morning, dear," Martha replied, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. By the time Frank arrived, looking unsure and slightly bewildered, Martha had already ordered them both coffee. "Sit down, Frank," she said, gesturing to the booth across from her. Frank obliged, eyeing her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "So, what's this all about?" Martha took a deep breath, folding her hands together on the table. "I want to fix this town," she said simply. Frank blinked, clearly taken aback. "Fix the town? Ma'am, what do you mean?" "You've seen it, Frank." "We all have," Martha said, her voice soft but steady. "Empty storefronts, families struggling to get by, businesses closing their doors. This town used to be something special, and now it's falling apart." Frank nodded slowly, his expression serious. "That's true enough. But what's that got to do with me?" Martha met his gaze. "I've come into some money. More than I could ever need. And I want to use it to help people, starting with Willow Creek. But I can't do it alone." Frank leaned back, his brow furrowed. "Money? What kind of money are we talking about here?" "Enough to make a difference," Martha replied carefully. "I want to start small, one project at a time. And I want you to help me rebuild this town, Frank. You're one of the best craftsmen I know. With your skills, we could repair these old buildings, give businesses a chance to thrive again." Where the money had come from, and what Martha expected in return. Some speculated that she'd lost her mind, that grief had driven her to impulsive decisions. But the truth didn't matter to Martha. What mattered was the look on Grace's face when the diner reopened, the way Frank's team stood a little taller with every job they completed, the renewed sense of possibility spreading through a town that had all but given up. On a quiet Sunday evening, as Martha stood on the newly restored steps of one of Main Street's old buildings, she realized something profound. Perhaps William Fletcher hadn't chosen her because of what she'd done in the past. Perhaps he'd chosen her because he knew she would do something, because he believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. The work was far from over, but for the first time in years, Martha felt alive. She felt like she belonged to something bigger than herself, like she was building a future her late husband would have been proud of. Willow Creek was changing, and so was she. What Martha didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that the ripples of her decisions were only just beginning. And somewhere, buried in the depths of her forgotten past, was a truth that would soon come to light. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. For the first time in decades, Willow Creek buzzed with life, its streets filled with a new kind of energy, a cautious hope. What had begun as a modest restoration of the diner had become something much larger, like a spark catching dry tinder. Frank and his team worked tirelessly, transforming abandoned buildings one by one. With every hammer strike and stroke of paint, a piece of the town was brought back to life. Businesses that had long stood empty now hummed with activity, a bakery run by a single mother, a hardware store finally back in business, and even a small bookstore that lit up Main Street's quiet evenings. The people of Willow Creek began to take notice, and so did the towns beyond. Rumors of a silent benefactor spread like wildfire. Some were inspired by the kindness, while others were skeptical. A few were outright suspicious, certain there was some hidden agenda behind Martha Collins' sudden generosity. People talked in the grocery aisles, in church pews, and over fences. Where did she get all that money? What's in it for her? Why would she spend it on this dying town? Martha heard the whispers, but she didn't let them bother her. Each time she stepped into one of the restored shops or saw a child skipping down the newly paved sidewalk, she knew she was doing the right thing. Robert would have been proud of her. Still, some nights, as she sat alone at her kitchen table, sipping tea and staring at the stack of letters from Mr. Thompson's office, she couldn't shake an odd sense of unease. There was something unfinished about all of it, something she couldn't yet name. One afternoon, as Martha supervised the installation of new windows in the old post office, a woman approached her. She was tall, sharp-featured, and wore an expensive coat that didn't belong in Willow Creek. Martha recognized her vaguely but couldn't place her. The woman didn't smile as she stopped in front of her. "You're Martha Collins, I assume," the woman said. Martha turned, her hands brushing dust from her coat. "Yes. Can I help you?" "I'm Evelyn Fletcher," the woman replied, her voice clipped and precise. "William Fletcher was my uncle." Martha froze, her mind catching on the name like a splinter. She hadn't thought much about William Fletcher since the day she'd signed the paperwork at Mr. Thompson's office. Though his name was the reason behind her mission, he remained a ghost, someone she couldn't quite remember and didn't fully understand. But here, standing before her, was his family. I'm sorry," Martha stammered. "I didn't realize Mr. Fletcher had family." "Of course he did," Evelyn said curtly. Family he ignored, apparently. Martha blinked, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not sure what you mean." Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I'm here because my uncle left a small fortune to a woman none of us have ever heard of. You, Mrs. Collins. And I want to know why." Martha swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the woman's scrutiny. "I wish I knew," she admitted. "I was just as surprised as anyone. Mr. Fletcher said I'd helped him once, many years ago, though I don't remember it." Evelyn scoffed, crossing her arms. "How convenient." "I beg your pardon?" Martha replied, her tone sharper than she'd intended. "You mean to tell me you don't even remember what you did to deserve $500,000? That my uncle handed his fortune to a stranger for no good reason?" "It wasn't my decision," Martha said firmly. "And it's not my money anymore. I'm using it to help this town, to help people who need it." Evelyn's expression darkened, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll see about that. My uncle's will may have named you, but my family has every right to challenge it." Martha felt a chill run through her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't over," Evelyn said, turning sharply on her heel. "You haven't seen the last of me, Mrs. Collins." She walked away without another word, leaving Martha standing in the middle of the dusty post office, her heart pounding. The air around her seemed suddenly colder, the walls pressing in on her. For the first time since this all began, doubt crept into her mind. What if Evelyn was right? What if William Fletcher had made a mistake? What if this money wasn't hers to use after all? That night, Martha sat at her kitchen table long after the sun had set, the words of Evelyn Fletcher echoing in her mind. She stared at the letters, the documents, the proof that William Fletcher had chosen her. But why? That question haunted her. Why her? Unable to bear the silence any longer, Martha picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Thompson's office. His voice was calm, reassuring, as always, when he answered. "Mr. Thompson," Martha said quietly, "I need answers. I need to know who William Fletcher was. What happened between us that I've forgotten?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll see what I can find," Mr. Thompson replied finally. There may be records or journals in Mr. Fletcher's estate that could help clarify things. But I must warn you, Mrs. Collins, sometimes answers aren't what we expect them to be. The next morning, Martha forced herself to focus on the work. She didn't want anyone to see the cracks forming in her resolve, least of all Frank, who was busy supervising a team at the old community center. Grace stopped by to check on things, bringing sandwiches and coffee for the workers. She smiled brightly when she saw Martha, though her expression softened as she studied her. Mrs. Collins, Grace said gently, is everything all right? Martha hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Finally, she forced a small smile. Of course, dear. Just a little tired, that's all. Grace didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Well, you've been working harder than anyone. Maybe take a break? You've earned it. Martha nodded faintly, though she knew rest wouldn't come easily. The days dragged on, and Martha found herself bracing for Evelyn Fletcher's return. The woman's words lingered like a shadow, gnawing at Martha's peace. Each time she looked at the restored storefronts or heard laughter from the children playing near the community center, she wondered if it would all come crashing down. It wasn't long before Mr. Thompson called. His voice was grave when he spoke. I've found something, he said. A journal Mr. Fletcher kept. There's an entry that mentions you by name. Martha's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. What does it say? I'd rather show you, Mr. Thompson replied. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Martha agreed, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and curiosity. That night, sleep was out of the question. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, memories long buried teasing the edge of her mind. Images she couldn't fully grasp swirled behind her eyes, a face, a moment, a feeling of desperation and relief. The next morning, she made her way back to Mr. Thompson's office, her palms damp and her chest tight. When she arrived, he handed her a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and delicate, and as she flipped to the entry marked with a ribbon, her breath caught. June 12, 1972. Today, a woman saved my life. I was a man without hope, ready to leave this world behind. But she didn't see a failure. She didn't see a lost cause. She gave me food, a kind word, and a reason to keep going. Her name was Martha Collins. I don't think she even realized what she did for me. But I'll never forget. Tears blurred Martha's vision as she read the words. A memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought of in decades. A rainy night. A stranger sitting on a bench outside the library, soaked and shivering. She'd given him her umbrella, a sandwich from her bag, and a few words of encouragement before walking away. She hadn't thought of it as anything more than a small kindness, but to William Fletcher, it had been everything. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. All these years later, her small act of compassion had saved a man's life. And in return, he'd given her the means to save a town. When she left Mr. Thompson's office, the weight she'd been carrying lifted. Evelyn Fletcher's threats didn't matter anymore. The whispers didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. Kindness, no matter how small, could ripple through time in ways no one could predict. And Martha Collins wasn't finished yet. Martha left Mr. Thompson's office with the journal clutched tightly in her hands, the weight of its revelation settling into her chest. The memory of that rainy night had been buried under decades of routine, grief, and the quiet solitude of her life. Now it surfaced with startling clarity. William Fletcher, a young man then, sitting on the cold bench outside the library, soaked through and shivering like a leaf. He'd looked lost, hollowed out by some invisible burden. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't pried. Instead, she'd done what felt natural, offered him half of the sandwich she'd packed for herself, handed him Robert's sturdy umbrella, and told him that the storms never lasted forever. She'd walked away that night thinking little of it, unaware that her small kindness had become a lifeline for a man on the brink of despair. And now, 30 years later, he had returned the favor in a way that had changed not just her life but the life of an entire town. As Martha walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek on her way home, she couldn't stop the tears that rolled down her cheeks. She wept not from sadness, but from something deeper, a recognition of how intertwined all lives were, how a single moment of grace could ripple through time like a pebble dropped into still water. It was humbling and awe-inspiring all at once. When she reached her house, she sat down at her kitchen table, opened the journal again, and read more. William's words painted a picture of his journey, a man who had been abandoned by friends, disowned by family, and crushed under the weight of his failures. That night in Willow Creek, he had planned to leave the world entirely. But her kindness had stopped him. It hadn't been grand or flashy, it had simply been human. He wrote of how that night had given him the courage to start again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth holding on to. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, and somewhere deep inside her, the last of her doubts began to melt away. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in fiery streaks of orange, Martha did something she hadn't done in years. She sat on her front porch, watching the quiet beauty of the world, and spoke to Robert. "You always told me to look for the good in people," she murmured softly, her voice cracking. "Well, here it is. I hope I'm making you proud." The next day, she arrived at the old community center just as Frank and his team were packing up their tools. The center, once a crumbling eyesore, was now a vibrant hub with new windows, fresh paint, and even a playground being built out back for the children. Frank looked up as Martha approached, a smile breaking across his face. "Well, what do you think?" he asked, gesturing proudly to the building. Martha smiled, warmth filling her chest. "It's perfect," she said softly. "You and your team have done more than just fix this place, you've given people hope again." Frank wiped his hands on a rag, his expression growing thoughtful. "We couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Collins. You know that, right? None of this would have happened without you." Martha shook her head. "It's not about me, Frank. It's about all of us. A town is only as strong as the people who live in it." As they stood there, a group of children ran past, laughing and chasing one another as they explored the new playground equipment. Parents lingered nearby, watching with smiles on their faces. The sight stirred something deep within Martha. For so long, Willow Creek had been silent, its streets empty, its spirit worn thin. Now, there was laughter, movement, life. It was contagious. Within weeks, word of the town's transformation spread beyond Willow Creek. Local news stations visited to cover the story of how one woman's unexpected inheritance had breathed new life into a dying community. Business owners returned to reopen their shops, and new families began moving in. For the first time in decades, Main Street bustled with activity. But with success came attention, the kind Martha hadn't wanted. True to her word, Evelyn Fletcher returned, this time accompanied by 2 lawyers. One evening, just as Martha was preparing for bed, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Evelyn standing on her porch, her face cold and unreadable. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself, Mrs. Collins," Evelyn said, her voice sharp as glass. Martha met her gaze evenly, tired but unshaken. "If you've come to intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Evelyn smirked faintly. "This isn't about intimidation. My family has filed a formal challenge to my uncle's will. You should expect to hear from our attorneys soon." Martha's chest tightened, but she refused to let the woman see her fear. "You don't understand, Evelyn. It's not about the money. It never was. Your uncle gave me something far more valuable, he gave me purpose. And if you take this money away, it won't stop me." Evelyn's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before she turned and walked back to her sleek black car. Martha stood in the doorway, watching her leave, her heart heavy with both anger and sadness. The legal battle began soon after. Mr. Thompson worked tirelessly to defend William Fletcher's final wishes, but the case attracted more attention than Martha had ever wanted. Reporters came to Willow Creek, cameras in tow, asking questions and hounding her for interviews. The townspeople rallied behind her, though. Letters of support poured in from people she'd helped, and Frank's team refused to let the work slow down, no matter the circumstances. Grace, ever loyal and fierce, stood by Martha's side. "Don't let them scare you," she said one evening over coffee at Lynn's place. "You're doing something real. They can't take that away." Martha nodded, drawing strength from the young woman's conviction. "Kindness doesn't come with conditions," she replied softly. "It spreads because it has to." The courtroom battle stretched on for weeks. Evelyn's lawyers painted Martha as an opportunist, a woman who'd manipulated their uncle. They brought up her humble past, her quiet life, as though those things were evidence of her unworthiness. Martha sat through it all with her head held high, even as doubt gnawed at her resolve. Then, one day, Mr. Thompson called a final witness to the stand. To everyone's surprise, it was a man no one recognized at first, an older gentleman with a kind face and sharp blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth. "My name is Daniel Fletcher," he said, glancing at Evelyn briefly before turning to the judge. "William Fletcher was my brother. And I know for a fact that his final wishes were genuine." Evelyn shot up from her seat. "This is ridiculous." "Sit down," the judge said sternly. Daniel continued, his eyes locking on Martha. "I don't think Mrs. Collins remembers me, but I was there the night she saved William. He called me later, crying, saying that someone had shown him kindness when he didn't deserve it. That night changed him. And it changed me, too." A hush fell over the courtroom as Daniel turned to Evelyn. "You're angry because you think he abandoned us, but he didn't. William found peace because of her. This money was never about us, it was about paying forward the kindness he received." The judge ruled in Martha's favor that same day, and the relief that flooded her body was unlike anything she'd ever felt. Evelyn left without another word, but Martha didn't think of her anymore. When the court case ended, the townspeople of Willow Creek threw a celebration in Martha's honor. The diner overflowed with people, laughter, and music. Frank and Grace stood beside her as she looked out at the crowd, a community reborn. Martha held up a glass, her voice strong and steady as she spoke. "Kindness doesn't cost us anything," she said. "But it's worth more than we can ever measure. All of you, every person in this room, has proven that. Willow Creek isn't just a town. It's a family. And I'm grateful to be part of it." Cheers erupted, and as Martha looked around the room, she saw the faces of people whose lives had been touched, children with hopeful eyes, families with second chances, workers with renewed pride. And somewhere, she knew William Fletcher was smiling, too. The celebration in Lynn's place carried on long into the night, a rare moment where time felt suspended and everyone in Willow Creek could breathe freely. Martha sat in her usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the people around her. Laughter rang out from every corner, filling the space with a kind of magic the diner hadn't seen in years. Grace was flitting from table to table, carrying trays piled high with pie slices and drinks, her smile lighting up the room. Frank leaned against the counter, telling stories to a small group of men who erupted into bursts of laughter every so often, his voice booming above the noise. Martha took it all in, her heart full. For so long, the town had been little more than a collection of empty buildings and forgotten dreams. Now, it pulsed with life again, and though Martha knew she'd only played a small part in that change, it filled her with a sense of pride she couldn't quite describe. She'd started with no grand plan, no blueprint for saving Willow Creek, only a simple desire to give back and make a difference. The work had taken on a life of its own, fueled by the people of the town and their shared hope for something better. Mrs. Collins? Martha looked up to find Grace standing beside her, holding a slice of pie. You look like you need a little something sweet, Grace said, setting the plate down in front of her. Martha smiled, shaking her head softly. You're too good to me, Grace. Grace sat down across from her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I'm serious, she said. You're a hero, you know that? Look at what you've done for this town. Look at what you've done for all of us. I'm no hero, Martha replied, her voice gentle but firm. I just gave what I could. It's the rest of you who took that spark and turned it into something more. Grace's smile faltered, her expression growing serious. Not everyone would have done what you did, she said. Most people wouldn't have shared that money. They would have kept it for themselves. Martha studied her for a long moment before replying. Grace, the only thing I ever truly owned in this world was my kindness. It doesn't cost anything, and it never runs out. That's the greatest lesson I've learned. Grace nodded quietly, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The sounds of the celebration swirled around them like a warm breeze. Then Grace leaned forward, her voice soft. Can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Grace hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of the table. What did it feel like when you found out about the inheritance? Martha thought about it for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the neon light of the diner's sign flickered against the dark night. At first, I was overwhelmed, she admitted. I didn't feel like I deserved it. I didn't know why William Fletcher chose me, or what I was supposed to do with something so big. But then I realized it wasn't about deserving it. It wasn't about me at all. It was about what I could do with it, for the people around me, for the people who needed it. Grace looked down at the table, her expression thoughtful. I hope I can be like you one day, she said softly. Martha reached across the table, taking Grace's hand in hers. You already are, Grace. You were the one who started all this, whether you realize it or not. That day in the diner, when you paid for my meal, you reminded me that kindness matters. You showed me that even the smallest gesture can change a life. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears as she squeezed Martha's hand. Thank you, she whispered. The two women sat together for a while longer, lost in the quiet comfort of the moment, until Grace was called back to the kitchen. As Martha sat alone in her booth once more, a wave of peace washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt that her life had come full circle, like all the scattered pieces of her past had finally fallen into place. A few days later, Martha received a letter in the mail. She recognized Mr. Thompson's handwriting on the envelope and opened it with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Inside was a simple note. Mrs. Collins, I thought you'd like to know that the legal challenge has been officially dismissed. William Fletcher's final wishes will remain intact. His faith in you was not misplaced. All my best, Benjamin Thompson. Martha exhaled a long breath, relief flooding through her. She set the letter aside and picked up the journal, which had become a constant companion in recent weeks. Flipping through the pages, she paused on one entry that had struck her deeply the first time she read it. We are all part of something larger than ourselves. Even the smallest kindness can ripple outward, touching lives we'll never see. The world is changed not by grand gestures, but by ordinary people choosing to do good, one moment at a time. Those words stayed with her as she made her way through the town that afternoon. Main Street was alive with activity, children playing, shopkeepers chatting with customers, friends gathering for coffee at the diner. The air hummed with possibility, and Martha realized how much had changed since the day she received that first letter from Mr. Thompson. Her next stop was the construction site on the edge of town, where Frank and his team were putting the finishing touches on a new building. It had once been an abandoned lot, overgrown and forgotten, but soon it would be something entirely different, a community center where people could gather, learn, and grow. It was Martha's largest project yet, funded by the last of William Fletcher's gift, and she couldn't wait to see it finished. As she approached, Frank looked up and waved, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're just in time, Mrs. Collins," he called. "Want to take a look?" Martha nodded, following him inside. The space was still unfinished, but she could see its potential: the wide-open hall, the classrooms along the edges, the bright windows that let sunlight pour in. Frank gestured to the far wall, where a plaque had been mounted. "Take a look at this," he said with a grin. Martha stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she read the inscription. "In memory of William Fletcher, whose life was saved by kindness. And in honor of Martha Collins, who reminded us that kindness can save us all." Tears filled Martha's eyes as she read the words, her heart swelling with emotion. She turned to Frank, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do this." Frank shrugged, his grin softening into something gentler. "It's the least we could do. You've given this town more than you'll ever know." Martha reached out, squeezing his arm as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. As she stood there, surrounded by the promise of what this place would become, Martha felt something shift deep within her. She realized that William Fletcher had given her more than just money, he had given her a purpose, a second chance to make a difference. And she had taken that gift and turned it into something far greater than herself. Months later, the community center opened with a celebration that brought the entire town together. There was food, music, and laughter, and as Martha stood at the front of the room, she looked out at the faces of the people who had become her family: Frank, Grace, the children, the workers, and the families whose lives had been touched by her quiet determination. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not just for being here today, but for believing in this town and in each other. None of this would have been possible without you. I hope you'll remember this: we all have the power to change lives. Sometimes it takes courage, sometimes it takes sacrifice, but it always starts with a choice." The room erupted in applause, and as Martha looked around, she knew that the ripples of her actions would continue long after she was gone. William Fletcher had believed in her when no one else had, and in turn, she had believed in the people of Willow Creek. That belief had transformed a town, a community, and perhaps most importantly, it had transformed Martha herself. When the celebration ended and the crowd began to disperse, Grace found Martha sitting quietly on one of the benches outside. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the last light of the day casting a warm glow over everything. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Grace said softly, sitting down beside her. Martha nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, it is." Grace looked over at her, her eyes bright. "You did it, Mrs. Collins." "No," Martha replied, shaking her head gently. "We did it." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha knew, deep in her bones, that she had finally found her place in the world, not as a hero, but as a woman who had chosen kindness and watched it grow into something extraordinary. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace.